Welcome. In this video, we'll be taking another look at factor by grouping. So if you didn't watch my first video on factor by grouping, you'll want to start with that one because I'm already assuming that you have some knowledge going into this one. So really my goal is to show you, again, a nice little tip that can help you expedite this process. So the first step for factor by grouping is to group into two groups of two terms. So we're going to start with number 1 as our example problem, and I'm just going to rewrite what we have. So we've got uz minus 5z minus 40u plus 8u squared. And so naturally my first instinct is just to group the first two terms together and the second two terms together. Step 2 then is to factor each group. So this first group, I noticed that both terms have a z in common. So what I'm going to factor out from each group is a z. So again, the GCF is what goes on the outside of the parentheses because that's the factor they have in common. And then on the inside is what's left over. So if I factor a z out of the first term, I'll have a u. If I factor a z out of the second term, I'll have a minus 5. Okay, and then this is the tip. So the tip is if you have a minus between groups, then factor out a negative GCF. Now, I can't say that this is always going to work, but it works in a lot of circumstances. So, in this case, if I look at the second group, well, the largest number that goes both into 40 and 8 is 8. And then they do share also a u, so, but I'm not going to factor out a positive 8u, I'm actually going to factor out a negative 8u. And so if I factor negative 8u from negative 40u, well, that leaves 5 left over. And then the second guy, so if I factor a negative 8u from 8u squared, that's going to leave just a single u left over. However, since it was positive and we factor out a negative, that's actually going to leave a minus u left over. Okay, now let's take a look and see what we have. So over in this first term, I now have a u minus 5 group. In the second term, I have a 5 minus u group. Well, that's okay, but these two groups don't match. U minus 5 is not the same as 5 minus u. So what that means is I have to make a change. Well, the change that I'm going to make is I only have a few options at my disposal, but instead of factoring out a positive z here, I could have also chosen to factor out a negative z. And that's the choice actually that I'm going to make here. So I'm going to factor out a negative z. And if I do that, well, negative z times negative u is going to give me positive uz. Okay, I can factor out whatever I want as long as when I multiply those pieces together, that gives me what I started with. So negative z times positive 5 is going to give me negative 5z. So now what I've got here matches what I started with. It's just another way to write what I started with. And then I'm going to leave the second group alone. And now when I compare my groups, I've got negative u plus 5 and 5 minus u. Those are exactly the same. So now I'm just going to write it in the same order. And now I can actually begin step 3, which is to factor again. So if I begin step 3, again, what I look for is the group they have in common, which is the 5 minus u group. So that's going to be my first factor. My second factor is going to be what's left over. So if I factor the 5 minus u out, that leaves me with negative z. If I factor the 5 minus u out of the second term, that leaves me with negative or minus 8u. And that is my answer. Okay, I want you to try number 2, pause the video, and then restart it when ready. So again, for number 2, if we just leave this time the groups in place without switching the terms around, the natural groups that we can form, let's see if that works. So what I'm seeing out of the first 2 terms, their greatest common factor is going to be a w. If I factor a w out of the first term, that's going to leave 9w. If I factor a w out of the second term, that's going to leave z. The second group looks like the GCF is going to be 4. So if I factor a 4 out of the first term, that leaves z. If I factor a 4 out of the second term, that's going to leave 9w. And now, looking at the 2 groups that I have, 9w plus z versus z plus 9w, those are the same. With addition, you can switch stuff around. So I'm just going to write everything in the same order. So instead of writing this as z plus 9w, I'm going to write it as 9w plus z. And then the final step is to factor once more. So the group they have in common comes first. That makes up our first factor. And the second factor is the leftovers, which is w plus 4. Okay. I want you to also try number 3. Pause the video and then restart it when ready. Okay, so for number 3, did you use my tip? So let's just group these guys together and these guys together. So looking at the first 2 terms, if I factor a 2 out, that's going to leave y minus 8x. The second group, notice how we're leading with a minus sign here, so that means I'm going to factor out negative, whatever the GCF is, in this case it's x. And that's going to leave me with, well, if I factor a negative x out of the first term, that leaves me with just a positive y. And if I factor a negative x from the second term, which was positive, that's going to leave me with minus 8x. Okay, again, why is that? Negative x times negative 8x is going to give me a positive. Okay, so when I factor, it should never change what I started with. Okay, then looking at the 2 groups, they match perfectly. So the final step is, again, I've got 2 factors. My first factor is the group they have in common. The second factor is what's left over. And I am done.